everyone. I'm Elisa, and we're back. So, this is part 4 of the circulatory system. We're talking about blood. And in this one, we're going to continue talking about plasma, and we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of hematopoiesis. So, blood plasma, continuing on, we talked about some of the components that it carries in it, such as primarily water, albumin, fibrinogen. But now we're going to look at some of the other ones, some of those including the nitrogenous compounds. These are going to be amino acid based, and they're from dietary proteins or the breakdown of tissues in the body. Primarily, we're going to see them in the form of urea, and these are oftentimes breakdown components, right? We just talked about them being wastes. So they're the end products of catabolism. So they're toxic, and we're going to try to remove them to the body. And so normally they're going to be removed in the urine, hence urea, by the kidneys, right, through the filtration. It also carries some nutrients, including sugars such as glucose, generally some vitamins, different types of fats. And so this is why, dietary fat is very important, right? You don't want to clog those arteries. Cholesterols, phospholipids, and of course some minerals, ionized minerals in that case. Also, we're going to see some dissolved gases such as oxygen, as well as carbon dioxide and nitrogen in various states. Also in blood plasma, we'll see quite a few electrolytes. So these are charged particles. So sodium makes up 90% of what we're seeing in terms of cations in plasma. Remember, cations like are positive, right? So, all right. So when we talk about blood, it's important that we're always monitoring viscosity. So that means like how thick is it, right? So when we're talking about viscosity, it's thickness. So like water is not very viscous, right? It slips right through your fingers. But then a milkshake, right, if you get a good one, is very viscous, very like it moves slow and it's thick and it's heavy. It's full of components, and that means it's resistant to flow, right? In the case of blood flowing through your veins, in the case of a milkshake flowing through a straw, as opposed to water, which flows very freely. And what happens, and the reason this occurs is we have lots of little particles, right? Sometimes they're charged, sometimes they have branch points, and they get tangled up, or they otherwise adhere to each other, right? Through all these different mechanisms. And so when they stick together, that means when they cohese or stick together, right? Then they make it thicker because they don't, they don't want to slip by each other. So this is very important that we have a relatively low viscosity in the blood so that we can have proper circulatory function, right? So if we have high viscosity, it's slow moving through the body. It's slow moving through the blood. We're higher for clots. It's definitely not bringing the watery components or taking away waste as quickly and as efficiently as it could. And we'll look at some of the disease states that will result from that later on. So whole blood is still thicker than water, right? So blood really is thicker than water. And plasma itself, after you take all of the like RBCs out or white blood cells as well, after you remove those, it's still like twice as thick or viscous as water. And that primarily has to do with some of the dissolved proteins like albumins and all of that good stuff. Osmolarity of blood. So we're talking about molarity, and we're talking about dissolved elements. So dissolved ions, cations, anions, larger particles. These are things that can't just dissolve readily through the blood vessel wall also. Sometimes they can slip through, but just not in abundance, for example. So it's important to maintain an optimum osmolarity through the regulation generally of sodium ions, right? So it's like salty. Blood is a bit salty, and also these proteins such as albumin that kind of float around and buffer that blood. If the osmolarity is too high, it absorbs too much water, right? So too much water wants to go to where the sodium is, okay? So just like osmosis, if you remember that, like we love to follow charged particles, and that's going to increase the blood pressure. And however, if you have too few, too low osmolarity, so you don't have enough of these dissolved ions in the blood, water doesn't want to go anywhere. It wants to stay in the tissue, and like bloating happens, and dropsy type conditions start happening, and the blood pressure plummets because it's losing water, it's losing the ability to circulate, and that means we can't use the heart to create that pressure and can maintain that circulation. So that's why the blood pressure will drop. um, so formally, any of these types of bloatings, this is edema, right? This is water that is caught up in the body causing that swelling in that area. Okay, so that is edema. Okay. So how is the blood produced? Now we're getting to the second part. So hematopoiesis. So hema, think of like the heme group of a red blood cell. And so that's why that's referred to that. So heme is generally referring to the blood. And poiesis, think of stem cell or like newly generated cells. If you can read that. Sorry, y'all. Um, Anyway, so it's the production of blood, especially new blood, particularly the formed elements or the cells, primarily is what we're talking about. So every day, like an average adult, like a younger, healthy adult, makes about 400 billion platelets, um, about 1 to 200 billion red blood cells, and 10 billion white blood cells. So this is, quite a bit. So hematopoietic tissues are things like the yolk sac. So this is early on in a pregnancy, early on. It has the stem cells for the first blood cells before, like in the earliest stages of embryogenesis, right? Before you really have bone marrow to do it for you, right? You really do need to kind of start producing these blood cells. So they're the ones that are going to eventually actually colonize that bone marrow and produce. Uh, Follow on to produce cells, liver, spleen, and thymus, which are all also key in not only the development of red blood cells and white blood cells, but the maturation, especially of some of these white blood cells, and the turnover of some of these older elements. Okay, so the liver plays a little bit of a role early on, producing red blood cells as well. So it's kind of this like everyone's tossing the hot potato of producing red blood cells down the line until embryogenesis is complete and the fetus is formed. So it stops producing red blood cells at birth, and the spleen is going to be uh, remaining involved in lymphocyte production, primarily kind of like the spleen works a lot in it's a filtering type organ, so it's going to be training oftentimes and maturing up some of these white blood cells. Also the thymus early on in individual's life, like the first 20 to 25 years, works pretty darn hard actually. But we'll get into that later on. Okay, specifically lymphoid hematopoiesis. So this is white blood cell stuff, right? Not red blood cell, white blood cell stuff. So the blood formation in the lymphatic organs, um, this is only involving, like I said, this is only the white blood cells. And then there's the myeloid group, which is a different type of white blood cell, which we'll get into. We're definitely getting into that. So these are going to be formed primarily in the bone marrow, and right. So, what I'd like to do is in the future PowerPoints, kind of get into this a little bit more with images. So that's enough to get your feet wet. And so I hope that was helpful. And great. So I hope you're having a wonderful day.